Consider for a moment the fragility of genius, how easily it might never exist at all. In the winter of 1642, as civil war tore England apart and Christmas Day dawned cold over Lincolnshire, a child entered the world so small he could fit inside a quart mug. The midwives shook their heads. They'd seen premature births before. This infant, they whispered, wouldn't survive until morning. His father already lay 3 months dead in Woolsthorpe's frozen ground. His mother, exhausted and alone, must have wondered what cruel fate had delivered this tiny, struggling life into a world of chaos and loss. That child was Isaac Newton, and he would survive to decode the cosmos itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The manor house at Woolsthorpe stood modest and grey against the English countryside, its limestone walls holding back the winter wind. Inside, Hannah Newton cradled her impossibly small son, this fragment of life that refused to surrender. The odds stood against him in every way that mattered. Infant mortality claimed 1 in 3 children in 17th century England. Premature births rarely survived a week. Yet something in this child's constitution defied the statistics, defied the knowing looks of village women who'd seen too many small bodies wrapped in linen. Young Isaac's survival marked only the first of many improbable victories. By age 5, while other children played simple games, he constructed elaborate sundials in the manor gardens that tracked time to the minute. Not crude approximations scratched in dirt, mind you, but precise instruments that accounted for the equation of time, that subtle difference between solar time and clock time that most adults never contemplate. He built them everywhere, on walls and windowsills, each one a statement that time could be measured, quantified, understood. But the sundials were merely the beginning. Isaac fashioned paper lanterns powered by candles, intricate constructions that caught the wind and glowed in the darkness. He'd release them on moonless nights, watching them float over Woolsthorpe's fields like supernatural visitors. Neighbours who glimpsed these lights thought them omens or spirits. Some crossed themselves and hurried indoors. The boy who terrified them with his creations was already exploring the boundary between natural philosophy and wonder, between what could be explained and what merely seemed magical. Then came the windmill. Not a toy, not a model, but a functioning machine powered by a mouse running on a treadmill. Isaac had observed the new windmill being constructed near Grantham, studied its mechanisms with an intensity that unsettled the workers. They'd find him standing motionless for hours, watching the sails turn, noting how wind direction affected rotation speed. Back at Woolsthorpe, he rebuilt the entire structure in miniature, complete with grinding stones that actually pulverized wheat into flour. The mouse, which he called the miller, seemed content with its work, motivated by strategically placed grain. Here was a child who understood leverage, gear ratios, and motivation before he could write his own name in a fair hand. But brilliance, as we so often discover, grows in the soil of suffering. When Isaac reached age 3, his mother Hannah made a choice that would haunt him for life. She remarried a wealthy minister named Barnabas Smith, a man of 63 who wanted a wife but not another man's child. Hannah moved to North Witham, a village just 1 mile away, close enough that young Isaac could see her house from Woolsthorpe's windows, close enough to know she was there, living her new life, close enough to feel abandoned every single day. The boy was left with his maternal grandparents, James and Marjorie Ayscough. Kind enough people, certainly, but they weren't his mother. For 8 years, Isaac grew up knowing Hannah was within walking distance yet forbidden to visit. She had chosen her new husband over her son. That rejection, that proximity to the mother who'd rejected him, forged something dark and permanent in Isaac's character. In later life, he would confess in his private writings to wishing his stepfather's house would burn down with both occupants inside. The rage he felt toward his mother and Barnabas Smith never fully extinguished. It became fuel, driving him toward achievements that would make ignoring him impossible. School offered escape. The free grammar school in Grantham accepted Isaac at age 12, but the 7-mile journey from Woolsthorpe made daily travel impractical. Instead, he boarded with the Clark family, whose patriarch served as the town apothecary. Imagine the fortune of this placement. While other boys memorized Latin declensions and biblical verses, Isaac lived above a shop filled with mortars and pestles, scales and solutions. The raw materials of chemical transformation. William Clark didn't just sell medicines. He compounded them, mixing ingredients according to ancient recipes and newer innovations. He showed Isaac how cinnabar yielded mercury, how certain plant extracts changed color with temperature, how acids dissolved some metals but not others. The shop became Isaac's laboratory, his introduction to experimental method. Years later, when Newton conducted his secret alchemical experiments, working for 3 decades to unlock the philosopher's stone, he would draw on techniques learned in that Grantham apothecary. But young Isaac wasn't merely absorbing chemical knowledge. In his bedroom, by candlelight that strained his eyes, he filled notebook after notebook with observations. 45,000 words of private documentation survive from these teenage years. 45,000 words describing how light behaved when passing through water, how shadows shifted throughout the day, how mathematical patterns appeared in flower petals and leaf arrangements. He invented recipes for colored inks, grinding minerals and crushing flowers to create pigments, mixing them with gums and solvents until he achieved exactly the hue he wanted. This wasn't idle curiosity. Even then, Newton exhibited the obsessive documentation that would characterize his mature scientific method. Every experiment recorded, every variation noted, every failure analyzed for what it revealed about nature's hidden mechanisms. While his classmates scribbled hasty essays to satisfy their masters, Isaac built systematic knowledge, layer upon careful layer. The contrast between his intellectual life and his emotional one couldn't have been starker. At school, he was peculiar, intense, often alone. Other boys found him strange. He didn't play their games or share their interests. When they fought, as boys do, Isaac's rage emerged with frightening intensity. He once kicked a boy in the stomach during a schoolyard scuffle, then forced him to acknowledge Isaac's intellectual superiority, not just to stop fighting, mind you, but to admit that Isaac was smarter. Even in violence, Newton sought validation of his mind. Then, in 1653, Hannah returned to Woolsthorpe. Barnabas Smith had died, leaving her wealthy and once again alone. She brought Isaac home, expecting him to manage the family farm and embrace rural life. For a boy who'd been calculating planetary positions and teaching himself Euclidean geometry, this felt like intellectual imprisonment. He was disastrously bad at farming. Sheep wandered away while he sat under trees working mathematical problems in his head. He missed market days because he'd become absorbed in books. The servants found him worse than useless. His uncle William Icecoff, recognizing the waste of brilliance, intervened. William had attended Cambridge himself, at Trinity College, and saw in his nephew something rare and precious. He convinced Hannah that Isaac belonged at university, not tending sheep. In June 1661, Isaac Newton arrived at Cambridge as a sub-Sizar at Trinity College. The term sub-Sizar reveals everything about Newton's status. Wealthy students paid fees and lived comfortably. Sizars worked for their education, performing menial tasks. Sub-Sizars occupied the lowest rung, paying tuition by emptying chamber pots, serving meals to their social betters, waking before dawn to prepare others' rooms. For a young man already seething with resentment toward authority, this arrangement poured acid on open wounds. He served students who couldn't match his intellect. He cleaned up after young men whose fathers bought their positions while his own father lay dead before his birth. Yet Newton arrived at Cambridge carrying secret weapons. During his supposed farming years, he'd been reading. Not just reading, but mastering works most Cambridge professors struggled to explain. He'd worked through Euclid's Elements, understanding geometric proofs that students typically encountered in their second year. He'd absorbed Descartes' geometry, where algebra and geometry merged in revolutionary ways. He'd studied Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, learning how mathematics could describe motion and force. When his tutors assigned basic Aristotelian texts, Newton was already beyond them, moving into territory where few could follow. He filled his notebooks with problems and solutions that anticipated discoveries still years away. Cambridge hadn't yet embraced the new natural philosophy sweeping Europe. They still taught medieval cosmology, Aristotle's Elements, Ptolemaic astronomy. Newton learned this material just well enough to satisfy requirements, then pursued truth on his own. But university life agreed with him in unexpected ways. For the first time, he found intellectual peers, other young men who cared about ideas more than lineage. Robert Hooke, who was already at Oxford, conducting experiments in pneumatics. Christopher Wren was designing buildings and solving mathematical puzzles. Across Europe, natural philosophers were demolishing old certainties and constructing new understanding. Newton, the sub-Caesar who emptied chamber pots, began to sense he might join their ranks. Then, in the summer of 1665, just as Newton's studies deepened, death arrived in Cambridge. Not personal death this time, but societal. The Black Death, which had ravaged Europe 3 centuries earlier, returned with terrible efficiency. It killed 1 in 4 Cambridge citizens that summer. Bodies piled in the streets. The university, recognizing the futility of remaining, scattered its scholars and sent them home until the plague subsided. For most students, this disruption meant lost time, interrupted studies, and forgotten momentum. For Isaac Newton, returning to Woolsthorpe's familiar rooms and apple orchards at age 23, it meant liberation. Alone, without professors or classmates or routine, he could finally pursue the questions burning in his mind without interruption. He had 18 months of isolation ahead of him. Those 18 months would change everything. Not just for Newton, not just for natural philosophy, but for human understanding itself. The fragile infant who'd fit in a quart mug was about to discover laws that governed not merely England or Earth, but the entire cosmos. In that quiet manor house, with only his books and instruments and that relentless, driving intellect, he would reach into the machinery of reality and extract its deepest secrets. The universe was about to yield to human understanding in ways it never had before, and all because a tiny premature child refused to die on that cold Christmas morning in 1642. Catastrophe, we've learned time and again, creates unexpected opportunities. When systems collapse, when normal routines shatter, space opens for transformation. The plague that emptied Cambridge in 1665 killed thousands, orphaned children, destroyed families and livelihoods. Yet for one young man returning to Woolsthorpe's quiet rooms, this disaster became the most productive period in the history of human thought. Isaac Newton arrived home in the summer heat carrying his books, his mathematical instruments, and questions that had been accumulating like pressure behind a dam. At Cambridge, he'd been constrained by curriculum, by the need to attend lectures and disputations, by the social requirements of university life. Now, alone in the manor house where he'd been abandoned as a child, he could work without interruption. No tutors assigning pointless exercises, no wealthy students to serve, no schedules but the ones he imposed on himself. The 18 months that followed would produce discoveries that most scientific institutions don't achieve in decades. 3 separate revolutions in human understanding, each sufficient to secure lasting fame, emerged from this single extended solitude. Newton himself would later call it his annus mirabilis, his year of miracles, though it stretched beyond 12 months into a period of sustained genius that remains unmatched. He began with light. This might seem an obvious starting point, but consider what light meant to 17th century natural philosophers. Aristotle had taught that colour was a property of objects themselves, that red roses were fundamentally different from white lilies because redness and whiteness existed as essential qualities. Descartes had proposed that light was pressure transmitted through an invisible medium. Hooke believed colours arose from light being modified by the materials it passed through. Everyone had theories, no one had proof. Newton approached the question with characteristic directness. He'd purchased prisms at Stourbridge Fair, triangular pieces of glass that vendors sold as curiosities, toys that made rainbows for children's entertainment. But Newton didn't want entertainment. He wanted understanding. In his childhood bedroom, with shutters closed against the summer sun except for a single beam entering through a small hole, he positioned his prism in the light's path. What happened next had happened countless times before. The white sunlight spread into a spectrum of colours on the opposite wall, red through orange and yellow and green and blue to violet. Nothing new there. Street performers created the same effect, but Newton didn't stop at observation. He asked the next question, the one no one had thought to ask with such precision. Was the prism creating these colours, or revealing something already present in the light itself? To answer this, he positioned a second prism in the path of one colour from the spectrum. If prisms created colour by modifying white light, then the second prism should create new colours from the isolated red or blue. But it didn't. Red light passing through the second prism remained red, blue remained blue. The prism wasn't creating anything. It was separating what already existed. Then came the crucial experiment, the one that demolished 2,000 years of theory in a single afternoon. Newton took the full spectrum emerging from his first prism and passed it through a second prism, positioned to recombine all the colours. White light emerged, pure, colourless sunlight, identical to what had entered the first prism. He could split it, recombine it, split it again. The process was reversible. White light, that apparently simple and pure illumination, was actually composite, a mixture of all colours travelling together until forced apart. Imagine the moment of realisation. Standing in that dimmed room, watching white light emerge from combined colours, Newton understood he'd discovered something fundamental about reality. Light wasn't what anyone thought it was. Vision itself operated on principles no one had imagined. The rainbow wasn't a magical exception, but a demonstration of light's true nature, revealed by raindrops acting as millions of tiny prisms. He documented everything with obsessive precision. The exact angles at which light entered and exited the prism, the measurements of each colour's refraction, the conditions under which the effect appeared or disappeared. Page after page of calculations and diagrams, building an irrefutable case that white light contained all colours. That colour was a property of light itself, not of the objects reflecting it. But light was merely the beginning. As summer turned to autumn in 1665, Newton's attention shifted to motion and force. Here, too, the old certainties were crumbling. Galileo had described how objects accelerated when falling, how projectiles followed parabolic paths. Descartes had proposed that planets moved in vortices of invisible matter swirling around the sunday. Kepler had discovered mathematical laws describing planetary orbits, but couldn't explain why planets followed these patterns. The pieces existed, scattered across Europe in various publications, but no one had assembled them into a coherent theory. The famous apple incident occurred during this period, though the story has been simplified almost to meaninglessness by countless retellings. Yes, Newton saw an apple fall, but he wasn't struck by sudden inspiration in a flash of insight. Instead, watching that apple's descent during a particularly hot August evening, he found himself contemplating a question that had troubled him for months. Why doesn't the moon fall to Earth? The moon clearly moves. It crosses the sky each night, completing its circuit in about a month. If you release an apple, it falls. If you throw a stone, it curves downward. Everything in our experience suggests that unsupported objects fall toward Earth's center. Yet the moon, obviously unsupported by anything visible, doesn't fall. It stays up there, following its circular path, apparently violating the palge, rules that govern falling apples and thrown stones. Unless, Newton reasoned, the moon is falling, not downward in a straight line, but falling around Earth in a continuous curve. What if the same force pulling the apple toward Earth at 32 feet per second squared also pulls the moon, but the moon moves forward so quickly that its fall matches Earth's curvature? It falls toward Earth constantly but never gets closer. Like a stone whirled on a string falls toward your hand but never arrives as long as you maintain the circular motion. This wasn't inspiration. This was mathematics. Newton spent months calculating the moon's orbital speed, its distance from Earth, the rate at which it fell toward our planet while moving forward. The numbers had to match. If gravity weakened with distance, which seemed likely, how much weaker would it be at the moon's distance compared to an apple tree's height? He tried various mathematical relationships. Inverse proportion to distance? That didn't work. Inverse proportion to distance squared? That produced numbers tantalizingly close to observation. The calculation required knowing Earth's size with precision. Newton used figures that were slightly inaccurate, and his initial results didn't quite match. Rather than forcing the conclusion or adjusting his theory, he set the work aside. For years, this nearly complete revolution in understanding lay dormant in his notebooks, waiting for better data about Earth's radius. When he finally obtained accurate measurements and recalculated, the numbers matched perfectly. The force pulling apples from trees extends to the moon, weakening with the square of distance but never disappearing. Think about what this meant. The heavens and earth, which philosophers since Aristotle had claimed were fundamentally different realms operating under different laws, were unified. The same force, gravity, governed both. The moon didn't stay aloft through crystalline spheres or divine intervention, or mysterious celestial properties. It fell, constantly, pulled by the same gravity you feel standing on the ground, following the same mathematical law whether orbiting Earth or dropping from a branch. But Newton still lacked the mathematics to fully describe what he'd discovered. How do you calculate the area under a curve when the curve constantly changes? How do you determine the exact rate of change at a single instant when change, by definition, requires time? How do you work with infinitely small quantities without falling into logical contradictions? Existing mathematics couldn't answer these questions. Geometry, perfected by the Greeks, worked wonderfully for fixed shapes but struggled with motion. Algebra could manipulate equations but couldn't capture continuous change. What Newton needed didn't exist, so he invented it. He created the method of fluxions, what we now call calculus, an entirely new mathematical language designed to describe the infinite and infinitesimal. The development of calculus emerged from pure necessity, like inventing words because existing vocabulary couldn't capture your thoughts. Newton conceived of quantities flowing through time, their rates of change themselves changing. He developed notation for these fluxions, methods for calculating them, rules for manipulating them. With this new mathematics, he could finally describe acceleration, the rate at which velocity changes. He could calculate the area under any curve, no matter how complex. He could solve problems that had been literally unsolvable with previous mathematical tools. Working entirely alone, without access to Cambridge's library or any mathematical colleagues to discuss ideas with, Newton derived the binomial theorem for fractional powers. This allowed him to expand expressions like the square root of 1 plus x into infinite series, powerful approximations that could be calculated to any desired precision. He used his methods to compute areas under curves, to 55 decimal places, accuracy far beyond anything practical, to necessity required. He calculated logarithms with unprecedented precision, developing series that converged rapidly to correct values. Each of these achievements would have secured lasting fame. Any one of them would have established a reputation as a significant natural philosopher. Newton produced them all in isolation, telling no one, publishing nothing. His notebooks filled with discoveries that wouldn't appear in print for years or decades. Why this secrecy? Partly, it was Newton's personality. He craved recognition but feared criticism, wanted glory but couldn't bear having his ideas challenged. The memory of his mother's rejection, of his subsizar status at Cambridge, had created a man who hoarded his discoveries like treasure, revealing them only when circumstances forced him to, or when he could no longer bear keeping them hidden. But there was another factor. Newton didn't see his work as complete. Each discovery opened new questions. Understanding light's spectrum led to wondering about light's fundamental nature. Was it particles or waves? Explaining the moon's orbit raised questions about all planetary motion. Did the same law govern Mars and Jupiter? Could it explain comets? And the calculus, powerful as it was, contained logical difficulties that Newton couldn't fully resolve. How could you work with infinitely small quantities that weren't quite zero, but weren't quite any particular size either? So he kept working. That autumn and winter of 1665 into 1666, snow fell on Woolsthorpe's grounds. The plague continued to rage in London and Cambridge, and in his childhood bedroom, by candlelight that strained his eyes and probably contributed to his later vision problems, Isaac Newton systematically dismantled and reconstructed human understanding of the physical world. Consider the audacity of it. A 23-year-old subsizar, barely beyond his undergraduate education, working in complete isolation, was solving problems that had defeated the greatest minds in Europe. He was discovering laws that governed not just England or Europe or Earth, but the entire universe. Every planet, every moon, every comet obeyed the same mathematical principles he was deriving in that quiet room. The same calculus that described a falling apple could predict the return of comets, calculate the tides, explain the precession of equinoxes. By the time Cambridge reopened in spring 1667, and Newton returned to complete his education, he carried in his notebooks the seeds of revolutions he wouldn't publish for decades. His optical experiments would eventually appear in print in 1672, causing immediate controversy. His calculus wouldn't be formally published until 1704, triggering the most vicious priority dispute in scientific history. And his masterwork on gravity and motion, the Principia Mathematica, wouldn't emerge until 1687, more than 20 years after he'd worked out the fundamental principles during the plague years. Those 18 months of isolation, forced by disease and death, had given humanity a new understanding of light, motion, and mathematics. 3 separate revolutions in thought, any one of which would have been remarkable, all emerging from a single extended period of focused solitude. The fragile infant who'd survived against impossible odds had become the mind that would reshape civilization's understanding of reality itself. But Newton's journey was far from complete. The discoveries were made, yes, but wars awaited him. Wars over priority, over credit, over whose name would be attached to these revolutionary ideas. The solitary genius would have to enter the brutal arena of the Republic of Letters, where reputations were made and destroyed through pamphlets and correspondence, where enemies pursued vendettas for decades, where science became as different, much about personal glory as about understanding nature. And Newton, brilliant as he was at mathematics and physics, would prove equally talented at rage, revenge, and the systematic destruction of anyone who challenged his priority or questioned his genius. The Republic of Letters sounds noble, doesn't it? A commonwealth of minds where natural philosophers across Europe exchanged ideas freely, building collective understanding of our world. In theory, this invisible nation transcended borders and politics, united scholars in pursuit of truth. In practice, it resembled a battlefield where brilliant men fought vicious wars over priority, credit, and reputation, using weapons of ink and intrigue. Robert Hooke stood at the center of this intellectual warfare, a man whose physical stature belied his towering intellect. Childhood rickets had left him barely 4 feet tall, his spine curved, his body twisted by disease, but his mind ranged across every field of natural philosophy with dazzling versatility. He'd invented the compound microscope, discovered cells in cork, formulated the law of elasticity still bearing his name, designed instruments for the Royal Society, and conducted experiments in optics, astronomy, mechanics, and chemistry. By any measure except one, Robert Hooke ranks among the 17th century's greatest scientists. That one exception? He wasn't Isaac Newton. Their war began in February 1672, when Newton, now nearly 30 and a Fellow of the Royal Society, finally decided to share his discoveries about light. He submitted a paper describing his prism experiments, his proof that white light contained all colours, his revolutionary understanding of the spectrum. The Royal Society received it with enthusiasm. Here was experimental work that anyone could replicate, conclusions that seemed irrefutable. They prepared to publish Newton's paper in their Philosophical Transactions, their journal that announced new discoveries to Europe's learned community. But first, as was customary, they asked certain fellows to review the work. One of those fellows was Robert Hooke, the Society's curator of experiments, responsible for demonstrating phenomena at their meetings. Hooke read Newton's paper with growing irritation, not because Newton was wrong, but because Newton had articulated ideas Hooke believed were his own, had conducted experiments similar to ones Hooke had performed, and worst of all, had done so more thoroughly and convincingly than Hooke ever had. Hooke's response, delivered at a Royal Society meeting in February 1672, fired the first shot in what would become a 7-year war. He didn't merely disagree with Newton's conclusions. He accused Newton of stealing ideas from Hooke's own work on colour, claimed Newton had misunderstood the nature of light, and suggested that Newton's reputation was being built on Hooke's foundations. These accusations were made publicly, in front of the Royal Society's fellows, recorded in their minutes, and transmitted through correspondence networks across Europe. Newton's reaction revealed the volcanic temper that lurked beneath his austere exterior. He didn't simply defend his work. He counterattacked with fury that shocked even those who knew him. His letters to the Royal Society dripped with barely controlled rage. He demanded to know how Hooke dared question experiments Hooke hadn't replicated. He systematically dismantled every one of Hooke's objections with mathematical precision, and then, most tellingly, he threatened to withdraw from all scientific communication entirely. This wasn't an idle threat. Newton meant it with every fibre of his being. If sharing discoveries meant enduring criticism from men he considered his intellectual inferiors, then he would share nothing. For 6 years, Newton effectively vanished from the Republic of Letters. He conducted experiments in total secrecy. He filled notebooks with discoveries he refused to publish. He invented a cipher for his most sensitive observations, creating an encryption system sophisticated enough that modern scholars still struggle to decode certain passages. Imagine the loss to human knowledge. During those 6 years of silence, Newton worked on optics, on planetary motion, on mathematics that would transform science. But he told no one. He published nothing. His discoveries remained locked in notebooks at Cambridge, unknown to the world, because Robert Hooke had questioned his priority. The conflict simmered through the 1670s, occasionally flaring when mutual acquaintances tried to mediate or when some development forced Newton to respond. Both men recruited allies. Hooke had the advantage of position as the Royal Society's curator, regularly demonstrating experiments and influencing fellows' opinions. Newton had the advantage of being right more thoroughly than Hooke, of having conducted experiments with greater precision, of having mathematical skills that Hooke couldn't match. Then, in 1684, the war exploded again, with consequences that would reshape physics forever. The setting was a London coffee house, one of those establishments where natural philosophers gathered to debate ideas over tobacco and coffee. Hooke was holding forth, as he often did, claiming he'd discovered the mathematical law governing gravity. Planets, he declared, attracted the sun with force that decreased as the square of their distance. He'd known this for years, he said, but hadn't yet worked out all the details or prepared his proof for publication. This boast reached Edmund Halley, an astronomer and mathematician who had become famous for the comet bearing his name. Halley knew the inverse square law was important if true, but talk was cheap. Anyone could claim discoveries they hadn't actually made or couldn't actually prove. Had Hooke really derived this law? Could he demonstrate it mathematically? Show that inverse square, the attraction would produce the elliptical orbits Kepler had discovered? Halley decided to check with Newton. In August 1684, he travelled from London to Cambridge and asked a direct question. What curve would a planet describe if attracted to the sun by force inversely proportional to the square of distance? Newton's immediate answer stunned him. An ellipse, Newton said. The planet would follow an elliptical path with the sun at one focus. How did Newton know this? Could he prove it? Of course, Newton replied. He'd worked it out years ago during the plague time. The proof was somewhere in his papers. He'd look for it and send it along. Halley's visit ignited something in Newton that Hooke's provocation had been building toward for years. Newton didn't just find his proof. He began expanding it, adding to it, placing it in context of a larger theory. Within months, this project had consumed him entirely. He worked 18 to 20 hours a day, often forgetting to eat. His cat reportedly grew fat eating the untouched meals servants left at his door. He lectured to empty rooms at Cambridge because he'd forgotten to check whether students had enrolled. The universe itself seemed to pour through his mind onto paper, crystallizing into mathematical form. What emerged was De Motu Corporum, on the motion of bodies, a treatise that would grow into the Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. For 30 months, Newton worked with intensity that approached madness. He slept 4 hours a night, sometimes less. He barely spoke to colleagues. He covered thousands of pages with calculations, with geometric proofs, with systematic demolition of every alternative theory and careful construction of his own. Edmund Halley served as more than Newton's publisher during this period. He became Newton's emotional anchor, the one person who could talk him through the mental collapse that threatened to destroy both Newton and his work. Several times, Newton announced he was abandoning the project. The pressure was too great. The perfection he demanded of himself seemed impossible. Halley would visit Cambridge, spend hours encouraging Newton, reminding him that the work was nearly complete, that the world needed these discoveries. Halley also paid for publication. The Royal Society had recently lost money publishing a history of fishes, leaving their treasury empty. When Newton completed his manuscript in 1687, Halley personally paid the £300 required to print it, roughly his entire annual salary. Without Halley's financial support and emotional sustenance, the Principia might never have appeared. Human understanding of the cosmos hung on one man's friendship and willingness to sacrifice his own resources. But as Newton neared completion, old wounds reopened. Robert Hooke learned about the Principia and claimed that Newton was building on Hooke's discovery of the inverse square law. Technically, this was partially true. Hooke had suggested inverse square attraction, though he couldn't prove it produced elliptical orbits. Newton's work went infinitely beyond mere suggestion, deriving the law from first principles and showing it explained every detail of planetary motion. tidal forces, cometary orbits, even the wobble in Earth's axis. Newton's response to Hooke's claim revealed the depth of his rage and the lengths he'd go to deny his enemies any credit whatsoever. He went through the nearly complete Principia manuscript and removed every single reference to Hooke's name, not just the acknowledgements, but even citations of Hooke's experimental work on springs and elasticity. Newton announced he would rather burn the entire manuscript than allow Hooke's name to appear anywhere in it. Think about this. The most important scientific work in human history nearly vanished because its author couldn't bear to acknowledge a rival's minor contribution. Halley had to negotiate carefully, eventually convincing Newton to complete the work by agreeing that Hooke's priority claim was baseless and his name need not appear. The Principia Mathematica finally appeared in print in July 1687. 500 copies of the first edition, written entirely in Latin, dense with geometric proofs, because Newton considered algebra too vulgar for nature's grand design. It contained 3 books that systematically explained gravity, motion, and their consequences, for everything from falling apples to planetary orbits to cometary trajectories. But Newton's war with Hooke didn't end with publication. It continued simmering with barely controlled hostility for 16 more years until Hooke died in 1703. Only then, when Newton became president of the Royal Society in 1703, did he achieve final victory over his enemy. And that victory took a particularly petty form. The Royal Society possessed the only known portrait of Robert Hooke, a painting that hung in their meeting rooms. After Hooke's death, this portrait vanished. No one knows exactly what happened to it, but strong circumstantial evidence suggests Newton had it destroyed. Imagine the vindictiveness required to erase even the image of a rival. Newton had defeated Hooke intellectually, had outlived him by 24 years, had achieved fame that dwarfed Hooke's reputation. Yet still, Newton allegedly sought to destroy the only visual record of Hooke's existence. Today, we have no idea what Robert Hooke looked like. Drawings and descriptions suggest his features, but no authenticated portrait survives. Isaac Newton may have made certain of that. The tragedy of their conflict extends beyond personal animosity. Hooke really was brilliant. His contributions to science were enormous and remain underappreciated largely because Newton's shadow swallows all light from that era. Hooke discovered or contributed to discoveries in dozens of fields. His Micrographia, published in 1665, revealed an invisible world of cellular structure and microscopic life. His law of elasticity, that strain is proportional to stress, remains fundamental to material science. His astronomical observations improved understanding of planetary rotation. In another age, without Newton as his contemporary and enemy, Robert Hooke would be remembered as one of history's greatest scientists. Instead, he's a footnote, the man who fought Newton and lost, the rival whose very image was erased. The Republic of Letters, that supposed commonwealth of minds pursuing truth collectively, had devoured one of its most talented citizens in the service of establishing another's supremacy. But Newton's wars weren't finished. While he'd been battling Hooke over priority in optics and gravity, another conflict was developing that would make their dispute seem like a minor skirmish. This new war would split European mathematics into hostile camps for generations, would involve royal courts and international prestige, and would pit Newton against an intellect nearly his equal in a fight over who invented calculus. The weapon both sides would use wasn't just correspondence and pamphlets this time. It was institutional power, the ability to marshal scientific societies and their publications in service of personal vendettas. And Newton, having learned from his conflicts with Hooke, would wield that power with ruthless efficiency that makes his later actions look almost calculated, as if he'd been preparing for this larger war all along. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was about to discover that challenging Newton's priority meant facing not just a man but an entire apparatus of reputation management and propaganda that Newton had been building for decades. The calculus wars would make the optical disputes look like gentlemen's disagreements, and they would reveal just how far Newton would go, how many rules he'd break, how completely he'd dominate the scientific establishment, to destroy anyone who threatened his claim to be not just a great natural philosopher, but the greatest who'd ever lived. Priority disputes in science can smoulder for years, but the calculus wars ignited with the heat of a supernova and burned for decades, consuming reputations and dividing continents. At the center stood two of history's greatest mathematical minds, each claiming to have invented the most powerful mathematical tool ever conceived. Only one could be remembered as the true inventor. Both men were willing to destroy the other to secure that legacy. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz arrived in London in 1673 as a diplomat and polymath, a man whose interests ranged from law to philosophy to mathematics. He was charming, sociable, everything Newton wasn't. The Royal Society welcomed him warmly, showing him their treasures, including some of Newton's unpublished mathematical manuscripts. This courtesy visit, meant to foster international scientific cooperation, would trigger the most vicious priority dispute in history. Leibniz saw Newton's methods for calculating tangents and areas, techniques that hinted at the revolutionary calculus Newton had developed during the plague years, but still kept largely secret. Whether Leibniz understood the full depth of Newton's methods from this glimpse remains debated, but 11 years later, in 1684, Leibniz published his own version of calculus in the Acta Eruditorum, a German scientific journal. His notation was elegant, intuitive, beautiful even. Where Newton used clumsy dot notation and talked about fluxions and fluents, Leibniz introduced the integral sign and the denotation for differentials that students still use today. His symbols made calculus accessible, teachable, powerful. Continental mathematicians embraced Leibniz's methods immediately, developing them into new theorems and applications. Newton saw theft, deliberate, calculated theft of discoveries he'd made 20 years earlier but kept private. The fact that he'd kept them private didn't matter to Newton. Priority belonged to whoever discovered first, not whoever published first. And Newton had definitely discovered first, back in 1665 and 1666, with witnesses who'd seen his manuscripts, even if they hadn't been formally published. For years, Newton simmered. He made veiled accusations in letters to colleagues. He published his own version of calculus in 1604, 3 decades after inventing it, with pointed comments about earlier discovery, but he couldn't let it rest. The rage that had consumed him during the Hooke disputes now focused on Leibniz with even greater intensity. In 1712, Newton weaponized the Royal Society itself. As its president, he appointed a committee to investigate the priority dispute between himself and Leibniz. This sounds reasonable until you examine the details. Newton secretly wrote much of the committee's report himself. He selected the evidence they would consider, determined which documents supported his case, and drafted their conclusions declaring Leibniz a thief and plagiarist. Then Newton went further. He anonymously reviewed his own committee's report in the Philosophical Transactions, praising its thoroughness and agreeing with its conclusions. He wrote letters to journals across Europe, sometimes under his own name, sometimes anonymously, always attacking Leibniz's character and credibility. He created what we might today call a propaganda campaign, using every tool at his disposal to destroy Leibniz's reputation. The dispute wasn't merely personal, it became international, a matter of national pride. English mathematicians rallied behind Newton. German and French mathematicians defended Leibniz. Princess Caroline of Wales, who'd studied with Leibniz, publicly defended her teacher against English accusations. The Republic of Letters fractured along national Leibniz. Lines, with accusations and counter-accusations flying in pamphlets, journal articles, and private correspondence that inevitably became public. Leibniz fought back initially, defending his honor and claiming independent invention. He had his own evidence, his own dated manuscripts showing his development of calculus. His methods genuinely differed from Newton's in important ways, suggesting independent discovery rather than plagiarism. But Newton's institutional power was overwhelming. The Royal Society's authority, Newton's fame from the Principia, England's scientific prestige all weighed against Leibniz. In 1716, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz died in Hanover, poverty-stricken and largely abandoned. His patron had become King of England and lost interest in his old teacher. The scientific community had turned against him under Newton's relentless attacks. Even his funeral was sparsely attended. Newton, hearing of his enemy's death, reportedly expressed satisfaction at having outlived another rival who dared challenge his priority. But Newton's victory came at enormous cost to science itself. The notation battle had profound consequences that Newton didn't foresee or perhaps didn't care about. English mathematicians, loyal to Newton, continued using his clumsy fluxion notation and his geometric methods. Continental mathematicians used Leibniz's superior differential and integral notation. The difference wasn't merely symbolic. Leibniz's notation made advanced calculations easier, made teaching calculus more intuitive, made progress faster. For a century, English mathematics stagnated while continental Europe advanced. The Germans, the French, the Swiss developed calculus into powerful new forms, creating differential equations, the calculus of variations, analytical mechanics. England produced few significant mathematicians during this period, having isolated itself in defense of Newton's priority claim and his inferior notation. Not until the 1800s, long after Newton's death, did English mathematicians finally abandon fluxions and adopt Leibniz's notation. Only then could British mathematics rejoin the mainstream of European development. Newton's insistence on priority and his suppression of Leibniz's contributions had cost his own country a century of mathematical progress. History's verdict came slowly but definitively. Today, we credit both men as independent inventors of calculus. Newton discovered it first. Leibniz discovered it independently and published first with better notation. Both deserve recognition. Both made enormous contributions. The tragedy is that neither man could accept this shared credit, that Newton used every weapon available to destroy a rival who'd actually arrived at similar insights through his own genius. The calculus wars revealed something about Newton that the Hooke disputes had hinted at but not fully exposed. He wasn't content with being recognized as brilliant. He demanded recognition as uniquely brilliant, as the sole originator of revolutionary ideas. He couldn't bear the thought that someone else might have discovered similar truths independently, that genius might not be as singular and isolated as he believed his own to be. This obsessive need for sole credit, this willingness to destroy rivals completely rather than share recognition, dominated Newton's later years. But there was another side to him, one that seems almost impossible to reconcile with the mathematical physicist who decoded the cosmos. Newton was about to transform again, from Cambridge professor and Royal Society president into something unexpected. London's most feared criminal investigator, hunting counterfeiters through the city's dark underworld with the same obsessive precision he'd once applied to planetary orbits. In 1696, Isaac Newton accepted an appointment that seemed beneath a man who'd explained the cosmos. Warden of the Royal Mint was traditionally a pesser, sinecure, a comfortable position requiring little actual work, a reward for political service or royal favour. Previous wardens collected their salaries and left the work to subordinates. Newton transformed the role into something else entirely. He became London's most relentless hunter of criminals, pursuing counterfeiters with the same obsessive focus he'd once directed at planetary motion. The timing was critical. England's currency was in crisis. Citizens had been clipping silver from coins for decades. shaving edges and melting the clippings into new coins or selling the silver. The nation's money was literally disappearing, coin by coin, clip by clip. The government ordered a complete recoinage, melting down all old currency and striking new coins with milled edges that couldn't be clipped. This massive undertaking required oversight, and Newton threw himself into it with characteristic intensity. But recoinage created opportunity for criminals. With old coins being recalled and new ones issued, counterfeiters could flood the market with fake currency during the confusion. Enter William Challoner, a man who'd risen from poverty to become London's most successful counterfeiter through sheer audacity and skill. His fake coins were so perfect that banks couldn't detect them. Merchants accepted them. Even mint employees sometimes couldn't distinguish Challoner's work from genuine currency. Challoner's arrogance exceeded even his skill. He testified before Parliament about improving mint security, offering helpful suggestions about preventing counterfeiting, all while running operations that produced thousands of fake coins weekly. He even accused the mint itself of incompetence and corruption, painting himself as a concerned citizen exposing official malfeasance. It was brilliant theatre, and Parliament took him seriously. Newton recognised a challenge when he saw one. Here was someone as clever as Hooke or Leibniz, but operating in the criminal underworld rather than the Republic of Letters. Newton approached the problem with scientific method. He couldn't simply arrest Challoner. He needed evidence that would convince a jury, proof that would lead to conviction. So, Newton became a detective. He established a network of informants throughout London's criminal districts. Tavern keepers, prostitutes, small-time criminals all reported to Newton about counterfeiting operations. He paid them from mint funds, building intelligence about who was making fake coins, where workshops were hidden, how the distribution networks operated. Newton tracked this information meticulously, creating files on every significant counterfeiter in London with the same precision he'd once catalogued optical experiments. Then Newton did something extraordinary for a man of his status. He went into the field himself. Disguised as a common citizen, Newton visited the taverns and brothels where criminals gathered. He listened to conversations, asked careful questions, built relationships with people who'd have fled if they knew who he really was. The Cambridge professor who rarely left his study, the Royal Society president who'd spent decades in isolation, was now working undercover in London's dangerous underworld. His investigation of Challoner took months. Newton personally interviewed over 100 witnesses, tracking down everyone who'd had contact with Challoner's operations. He visited Newgate Prison repeatedly, interrogating arrested criminals in its stone cells, offering deals to those who'd testify against Challoner. He applied mathematical analysis to crime, tracking the distribution patterns of fake coins to locate manufacturing sites, using statistical methods to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Challoner tried every defense. He claimed Newton was persecuting him out of spite. He accused mint officials of framing him to cover their own crimes. He had allies in Parliament who believed his stories about corruption. But Newton's evidence was overwhelming. 50 witnesses testified to Challoner's counterfeiting activities. Newton had documentation of workshops, tools, dyes, and distribution networks. The case was airtight. In March 1699, William Challoner was hanged at Tyburn, London's execution ground. Newton attended, watching to ensure the sentence was carried out. He'd pursued Challoner with the same relentless determination he'd once pursued cometary orbits, and with the same ultimate success. The message was clear. Threatening England's currency was as foolish as challenging Newton's scientific priority. During his tenure as warden and later master of the Mint, Newton prosecuted 28 counterfeiters to their deaths. 28 men hanged because they'd crossed the scientist who decoded gravity. He showed no mercy, no hesitation. Counterfeiting was treason, punishable by death, and Newton ensured the law was enforced with mathematical precision. But Newton's mint work went beyond catching criminals. He supervised the complete recoinage of England's money, overseeing the melting and restriking of £6.8 million sterling. In modern terms, that's roughly $2 trillion worth of currency, all processed under Newton's direction. He worked at unprecedented speed, pushing the mint's workers to produce £50,000 worth of new coins weekly, far exceeding previous output. His scientific mind revolutionized the mint's operations. He improved furnace designs to melt silver more efficiently. He standardized processes to ensure consistent quality. He tracked production with detailed records that let him identify problems immediately. The mint under Newton became a model of efficient administration, producing the highest quality currency England had ever seen. Yet there's something unsettling about this period of Newton's life. The man who'd unlocked universal gravitation was now sending criminals to the gallows with the same certainty he'd once applied to mathematical proofs. His pursuit of counterfeiters showed the same obsessive focus, the same inability to let challenges go unanswered, the same need for absolute victory that had characterized his scientific disputes. William Chaloner wasn't Robert Hooke or Gottfried Leibniz. He was a criminal who genuinely threatened the nation's economy. But Newton's approach to destroying him differed little from his approach to destroying scientific rivals. Gather overwhelming evidence, use institutional power, show no mercy, ensure complete victory. The target changed, but the method remained constant. In 1700, Newton was promoted to Master of the Mint, making his role permanent and even more powerful. He held this position for the rest of his life, earning a salary that made him wealthy by any standard. The sub-Caesar, who'd once emptied chamber pots, now controlled England's money supply and commanded respect that transcended academic circles. His transformation from natural philosopher to government official was complete, but the scientific work wasn't entirely finished. The Principia needed revisions, incorporating new observations and responding to criticisms. And Newton's understanding of gravity, comprehensive as it was, left one fundamental question unanswered. He described how gravity worked, how it acted across space, how its strength decreased with distance, but he couldn't explain why it worked, what caused masses to attract each other across empty void. This gap in understanding troubled Newton deeply. He'd built a mathematical framework that predicted every planetary motion, every tidal variation, every cometary return. Yet the cause of gravity itself remained mysterious, hidden behind the mathematics that described its effects. Newton knew this limitation, he acknowledged it, and he refused to speculate beyond what mathematics and observation could prove. That intellectual honesty, that recognition of the boundary between knowledge and speculation, would prove to be one of his greatest legacies. The mathematical principles of natural philosophy emerged into the world in July 1687, like nothing that had come before. 500 copies of the first edition, written entirely in Latin, dense with geometric proofs that required weeks of study to fully comprehend. It wasn't merely a book about physics or astronomy. It was a complete reconstruction of how humanity understood physical reality, built from mathematical first principles with inexorable logic. Newton had written it in the language of geometry deliberately. He considered algebra too vulgar, too mechanical for expressing nature's grand design. Every proposition proved through elegant geometric demonstration, each building on previous ones, creating an architecture of understanding that grew more comprehensive with each page. Reading the Principia required serious mathematical preparation. Many who purchased it couldn't follow the arguments, but those who could found themselves looking at the universe through entirely new eyes. The work consisted of 3 books, each revolutionary in its own right. Book 1 established the mathematical framework, proving how forces acting on bodies produced motion, how gravity's inverse square law generated the elliptical orbits Kepler had discovered empirically. Book 2 demolished Cartesian vortex theory, showing mathematically that planets couldn't possibly move through swirling matter as Descartes had proposed. Book 3 applied these principles to the actual solar system, explaining every observed phenomenon from planetary motions to tidal variations. But the true genius lay in what Newton had accomplished methodologically. He'd shown that nature obeyed mathematical laws, that these laws could be discovered through observation and reason, and that once discovered, they predicted phenomena not yet observed with stunning accuracy. This wasn't just physics. It was a new way of understanding reality itself, a demonstration that the universe was comprehensible to human minds willing to think mathematically. Consider what Newton proved in those pages. Every particle of matter in the universe attracts every other particle with force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This single law, simple enough to state in a sentence, explained everything. Why apples fall, why the moon orbits Earth, why Earth and other planets orbit the Sun in ellipses, why comets follow parabolic or hyperbolic paths depending on their speed, why the tides rise and fall twice daily, higher during full and new moons. Newton calculated Earth's exact shape, proving it must bulge at the equator due to rotation. Measurements made decades later confirmed his prediction to remarkable precision. He explained the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble in Earth's axis taking 26,000 years to complete a cycle, as resulting from the Moon and Sun's gravitational pull on Earth's equatorial bulge. Ancient astronomers had observed this precession, but couldn't explain it. Newton's mathematics revealed its cause. He predicted the return of comets. Edmund Halley used Newton's methods to calculate that the bright comet of 1682 was the same object that had appeared in 1607, in 1531, in 1456. Following a 76-year orbit around the Sunday, Halley predicted it would return in 1758. It did, right on schedule, 16 years after Halley's death and 31 years after Newton's. The comet's return provided spectacular confirmation of Newtonian physics, proof that human mathematics could predict celestial events decades in advance. Ship navigators used Newton's lunar tables to determine longitude at sea. Before accurate chronometers existed, comparing the moon's position against Newton's predictions let sailors calculate their east-west position, solving one of navigation's greatest challenges. Lives were saved because Newton had calculated the moon's complex orbit with sufficient accuracy for practical use. The Principia's impact rippled through civilization in waves. Voltaire learned Newtonian physics from his lover, Émilie du Châtelet, who translated the Principia into French and explained it with commentaries that made Newton's ideas accessible to continental readers. The French Academy of Sciences, initially skeptical of Newton's action at a distance gravity, sent expeditions to measure Earth's shape. When measurements confirmed Newton's predictions, French natural philosophers converted to Newtonianism. Engineers applied Newton's laws to build machines that powered the Industrial Revolution. Understanding force, mass, and acceleration let them calculate the strength needed in beams and axles, predict how engines would perform, design structures that wouldn't collapse under their own weight. The mathematical physics Newton pioneered became the foundation for technological civilization. Yet Newton himself knew the work's profound limitation. He described how gravity worked with mathematical precision, but he couldn't explain why it worked. How could the Sun reach across 93 million miles of empty space to hold Earth in orbit? How could masses attract each other without any intervening medium, no chains or ropes or fluids transmitting the force? This troubled Newton deeply. In the Principia's later editions, he wrote that he feigned no hypotheses about gravity's cause. He discovered the mathematical law governing gravitational attraction, but the physical mechanism remained hidden. This intellectual honesty, this refusal to speculate beyond what mathematics and observation proved, set a standard for scientific method that persists today. Newton drew a clear line between what he knew and what he didn't, between mathematical description and physical explanation. Later, physicists would need 2 more centuries and Einstein's general relativity to answer the question Newton couldn't. Gravity isn't a force transmitted across space, but rather the curvature of space-time itself, caused by mass and energy. The Principia went through multiple editions during Newton's lifetime. He revised and expanded it, responding to criticisms, incorporating new observations, refining calculations. The second edition appeared in 1713, the third in 1726, just a year before his death. Each edition strengthened the work, addressed objections, demonstrated that Newtonian physics could withstand every test. By the time of his death, Newton had achieved something unprecedented in human history. His laws governed not just England or Europe or Earth, but the entire cosmos. Every planet orbiting every star, every moon circling every planet, every asteroid and comet and piece of cosmic debris obeyed the same mathematical principles he'd derived in that quiet room at Woolsthorpe during the plague years. He'd unified celestial and terrestrial physics, showing that heaven and earth followed identical laws. The universe Newton revealed was mechanical, predictable, comprehensible. Given the position and velocity of every particle at one moment, his laws could in principle predict the future and retrodict the past. This clockwork cosmos, wound up by some creator and running according to mathematical law, would dominate physics for 2 centuries, until quantum mechanics and relativity revealed deeper layers of reality. But that lay far in the future. In Newton's time, the Principia stood as humanity's greatest intellectual achievement, proof that human reason could decode the cosmos itself. The fragile infant who'd survived against all odds had given his species the mathematical tools to understand their place in the universe, not through divine revelation or ancient wisdom, but through observation, mathematics, and relentless reasoning. Yet Newton believed his scientific achievements were merely a small part of his life's work. In his final years, as his body weakened and death approached, he spent less time on physics and more on the writings he'd always considered more important. His attempts to decode biblical prophecy and his alchemical quest to uncover the hidden structure of matter. The public Newton, master of celestial mechanics, was about to reveal a secret Newton who'd existed all along, hidden beneath the mathematician's austere exterior. Isaac Newton spent his final 30 years as England's most powerful intellectual, simultaneously president of the Royal Society and master of the Mint, wielding both positions to shape scientific discourse and national policy. He'd achieved everything ambition could desire: fame that transcended borders, wealth that made him comfortable beyond imagination, power to crush anyone who challenged his authority. Yet in his private study, away from public eyes, Newton pursued obsessions that would have shocked those who knew him only as the rational mathematician who decoded the cosmos. The secret emerged after his death. Executors sorting through Newton's papers at his London residence discovered trunks filled with manuscripts that dwarfed his scientific output. 3 million words of religious writings, extensive alchemical treatises describing experiments conducted over 3 decades, biblical chronologies calculating creation's date from scriptural passages, prophecies decoded from the Book of Daniel and Revelation. This was the work Newton believed truly mattered, the investigations he considered more important than discovering gravity. Newton had calculated from biblical genealogies that God created the world in 4004 BC. He'd worked out chronologies of ancient kingdoms, dating events in Egyptian, Persian, and Greek history by correlating them with astronomical phenomena mentioned in texts. He'd analyzed the architecture of Solomon's temple described in Scripture, believing its proportions encoded divine truths about the universe's structure. These weren't casual interests or minor diversions. Newton devoted more time to biblical chronology than to the Principia. His religious views would have been heretical if publicly known. Newton secretly rejected the Trinity, believing Christ was divine but subordinate to God the Father, not co-equal. In an age when denying the Trinity could mean death, Newton hid these beliefs carefully, never taking holy orders despite Cambridge requiring it, obtaining special dispensation that let him avoid religious commitments that would force him to publicly affirm doctrines he privately rejected. The alchemical work went deeper still. For 30 years, Newton maintained a laboratory where he conducted chemical experiments seeking the philosopher's stone, that legendary substance that supposedly could transmute base metals into gold and grant immortality. His manuscripts described successful creation of philosophical mercury, a substance he believed would enable transmutation if only he could achieve proper stellar alignments and purification processes. We might dismiss this as delusion, the great scientist wasting decades on impossible dreams, but Newton saw no contradiction between his mathematical physics and his alchemical pursuits. Both sought to understand nature's hidden architecture. Both required careful experimentation and precise documentation. The same mind that calculated planetary orbits also tracked chemical reactions, noting color changes, temperature variations, crystallization patterns. He believed matter contained secrets that chemistry hadn't yet revealed, that transformation of elements was possible if one understood the underlying principles. His calculations about the world's end showed the same mathematical precision he'd applied to planetary motion. From biblical prophecy, Newton determined that the apocalypse couldn't occur before the year 2060. Might not occur, but couldn't. He'd decoded what he believed were mathematical patterns in Scripture that predicted historical events and set boundaries on possible futures. The universe obeyed mathematical laws not just in physics but in divine planning, and Newton believed he could read those laws in biblical texts. What do we make of this duality? The man who gave us universal gravitation also spent decades trying to turn lead into gold. The scientist who insisted on empirical proof and mathematical rigor also claimed to decode prophecies about the world's end. Modern scholars sometimes try to separate Newton, the rational scientist, from Newton, the mystical seeker, but this division falsifies his lived experience. Newton saw himself as God's chosen decoder of universal truth, whether that truth appeared in planetary orbits or biblical passages. In 1727, Newton's health began failing. He was 84 years old, an extraordinary age for that era. Kidney stones caused excruciating pain. Doctors recommended opium to ease his suffering, but Newton refused. He wanted to maintain mental clarity until the end, to remain conscious and aware. His last weeks were agonizing, but his mind stayed sharp. On March 20th, 1727, Isaac Newton died in his sleep. His final recorded words, spoken days earlier, have become famous. I don't know what I may seem to the world, but to myself I seem only like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before me. Consider the humility in that statement from a man who decoded more of that ocean than any predecessor. He discovered universal gravitation, invented calculus, revolutionized optics, explained tides and comets and planetary motion. He'd given humanity mathematical tools that would enable everything from steam engines to spacecraft, yet he saw himself as a child collecting shells while the vast ocean of truth remained mostly unexplored. England buried him in Westminster Abbey with honours usually reserved for royalty. The pallbearers included dukes and earls. Voltaire attended the funeral, later writing that England honoured a mathematician as France might honour a king. Newton was the first scientist ever interred in Westminster Abbey, his tomb bearing an inscription celebrating his accomplishments and declaring that mortals should rejoice that such glory to the human race had existed. But what did Newton himself believe his legacy would be? Based on the sheer volume of his writings, He expected to be remembered primarily for his religious interpretations and biblical chronologies. The Principia was important, certainly, but he'd unlocked Scripture's secrets, calculated creation's date, decoded prophecy. Surely this would matter more than merely explaining gravity. History judged differently. Today, Newton's religious writings gather dust in archives, studied mainly by scholars trying to understand his psychology. His alchemical manuscripts, sold at auction in the 20th century and scattered across institutions, reveal a mind we struggle to comprehend. But his physics, his calculus, his mathematical descriptions of natural law, these became the foundation of modernity. Newton's equations guide spacecraft to distant planets with millimeter precision. Engineers use his laws of motion to design everything from bridges to rockets. His calculus underpins all modern technology, from computer graphics to financial modeling. GPS satellites orbiting Earth require Newtonian physics to function, with only tiny relativistic corrections at their speeds. Newton's mathematical framework remains accurate enough that we use it daily without thinking, only needing Einstein's refinements when approaching light speed or extreme gravity. The fragile infant born 3 months premature on Christmas Day, 1642, the child abandoned by his mother, the sub-Caesar who emptied chamber pots, the isolated genius who worked in secret, the vengeful competitor who destroyed rivals, the detective who hunted criminals, the mystic who sought to transmute metals and decode prophecy. All these Newtons existed in one complicated, contradictory, brilliant man. He wasn't merely a scientist. He was the scientist, the one who showed humanity that the universe could be understood through mathematics, that natural laws could be discovered and expressed in equations, that the same principles governed falling apples and orbiting moons. Everything we call physics traces back to Newton, to those 18 months at Woolsthorpe when a young man wrestling with plague-induced isolation reached into the machinery of reality and pulled out its deepest secrets. 300 years have passed since Newton's death. We've split atoms, decoded DNA, detected gravitational waves, mapped the cosmic microwave background. We've found quarks and black holes, quantum entanglement and dark energy. We've discovered realms of reality Newton never imagined. Yet when astronauts launch toward the International Space Station, when probes journey to Saturn's moons, when engineers calculate loads on bridges, they still use Newton's laws. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. 3 words capturing a truth so fundamental that 3 centuries of physics has refined it without replacing it. The great ocean of truth that Newton spoke of remains vast, mostly unexplored, but the shells and pebbles he collected on that shore, the mathematical principles he discovered through pure reason and relentless observation, became tools that let humanity wade deeper into those waters. We stand on his shoulders, seeing further not because we're greater, but because Newton lifted us higher than anyone before him had managed. That's his legacy. Not the biblical chronologies he treasured, not the alchemical secrets he pursued, but the mathematical laws that govern everything from planets to pendulums, from tides to trajectories. Isaac Newton didn't just explain how the universe works. He showed us that we could explain it, that human minds possess the capacity to understand the cosmos itself. That gift, that demonstration of reason's power, transformed civilization in ways he couldn't have predicted but surely would have appreciated. The boy who fit in a quart mug became the man who measured the universe.